This is the Comics Alternative, on location and talking with Sonny Liew at the University of Texas at Dallas. Hello, and welcome to the Comics Alternative for a special on-location episode. I'm Derek, one of the co-hosts and the producer of this podcast. On April 13th, the School of Arts, Technology, and Emerging Communication at the University of Texas at Dallas had as a guest speaker the comics artist Sonny Liew, whose new book, The Art of Charlie Chen Hock Chye, was released by Pantheon Books in March. What you're about to hear is a recording of that event that took place at the Eugene McDermott Library. There, Sonny and I talked about his new book, the place of Singapore in his work, and his experiences in the comics industry. Throughout the conversation, Sonny shared PowerPoint slides of his varied illustration work and fielded questions from the audience. At times, the audience questions may be difficult to make out in the recording, but Sonny's responses give enough context to understand what was asked. Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming today. I'm pleased to introduce Sonny Liew. Sonny is a young and incredibly prolific artist based out of Singapore. He's had an impressive creative output over the past 20 years. He's worked for both Marvel and DC Comics, and right now he's even illustrating the current run of Dr. Fate. But he's also written and drawn for a variety of other publishers, including Image Comics, Boom Studios, Archaea Entertainment, First Second Books, Slave Labor Graphics, Disney Press, and the French publisher Delcourt. His books include Malinky Robot, Liquid City, My Faith in Frankie, The Regifters, adaptations of Lewis Carroll's Wonderland and Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and, along with Jean Louis Yang, he brought us the critically acclaimed work The Shadow Hero in 2014. His latest work, The Art of Charlie Chen Hock Chye, was released last year in Singapore and then just last month from Pantheon Books. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Sonny Liew to the UTD campus.
I'm going to let's see. So I usually start the slides off with this picture of a car, and the reason is if you look at the price of a car in the US, like this car, it's about $20,000 in the US to buy this car, and in Singapore the same car will cost you $75,000, right? And this one, which is a BMW 40K in the US, in Singapore it's going to set you back $130,000, and that's all down to taxation, sort of a tax on buying cars. And the reason why I put it up there is kind of just to give you an idea how different the system is in Singapore. We might talk about it later, exactly why this happens, but just to have these numbers in mind. And the rest of the slides are just comics I've done throughout my career. Like this was my first published comic in Singapore, which was really raw. Back then I didn't even know how to draw the gutters. I would just draw like a crisscross line, and my lettering was terrible. But eventually I ended up at RISD, which is in Providence, right? And went to art school there. So yeah, I'm going to play this in the background. I think Derek will ask me questions, and if you guys have any questions about any of the images, just anytime raise your hands and we can talk about them. All right. So,
Sonny, you started talking about your early career,
right?
And I was going to ask you about the transition between doing stuff on your own and then being recognized by others in the industry, but then I just looked up and I'm seeing this image of a Hitler car? So I have to ask you about the Hitler car.
This was just a class I took at RISD in caricature. So one of the many classes I took in RISD. Mm-hmm. It's just a mashup between Hitler and the Volkswagen, which is sort of a Nazi car in a sense. We did things like this one, Boris Yeltsin. So, before I went to art school, I was essentially self-taught. I'd done comics for maybe 3 or 4 years in my previous college, but I didn't really know anything about art. Yeah.
Did you do the face of this one on Scratchboard? Or?
Yeah, Scratchboard, that's right, yeah. So yeah, going to RISD was sort of my first art school experience. I had to learn about color, learn how to paint, learn more about comics in general. So I took a lot of classes in illustration in general.
Well, I know that a lot of our students are either currently or have taken courses in illustration, design, and animation. I wonder if you can speak on your experience in making those steps from doing it on your own, working in the classroom, and then being recognized eventually by the industry.
I guess it's basically just about getting your work seen and heard by the right people. Like in comics, the way to get work, I guess, is either to send your work into the publishers or to go to conventions and do the portfolio review thing. And just getting it published, whether it's in zines or online. I think once your work is out there, there's a chance that you get seen by an editor or a writer who wants to work with you. I'm not quite sure how it works in games or any other field, but I'm guessing it's really just about getting your work out there in some form or another.
Now, in your recent book, the Art of Charlie Chen Hock Chye, we do get toward the end the main character, Chan, who comes to the United States and shows his work at the San Diego Comic-Con with, I was about to say with mixed results, but it's not overly positive results, I guess.
Sure.
And so he was kind of frustrated. What about your own experience and experiences of people that you know of as well who've tried to do the same thing in terms of going out there to try to get their work seen, being frustrated, and then just keep on doing that or attempting to do that?
Well, my own experiences at San Diego were mixed, I would say. So there are people who really like to work and from the very beginning wanted to kind of let me do some work for them or with them. But there were also cases where people would be, indifferent to what they saw in a portfolio. They would flip through it really quickly and sort of wave you on to the next table. So, and I have friends who were also at RISD at the time who went to send their work into Marvel or DC and essentially got rejected in different ways. So I think when you're in art school, you always dream of being the next superstar artist, whether you're a painter or animator or comic artist. But and that can happen, but I think that's really very rare. And for most of us, we have to kind of grind it out for many years, I think. Like myself, I sort of my aim when I first started doing comics was to be able to do more personal stuff, like I guess people I admire, like Daniel Clovis or Chris Ware, be examples of people who have careers where they can do their own personal work, but also make a living out of it. And that's something I've been trying to achieve for the last 10, 20 years, really. And it's only I think the last couple of years that I'm starting to see that as being even vaguely possible with sort of the few books I've done since Shadow Hero, really.
So, I mean, do you think that it is Shadow Hero around that time that you began to feel that you were starting to take off?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like every book that I did from the beginning, I thought it would be the big thing that will launch my career at some level. Or when I got an ISO nomination, for Wonderland, I thought surely now I'm going to get a lot of work from publishers. But the truth is that all those things were at best sort of incremental improvements in the career. And so it's never been like a one big leap, but it's kind of been a slow building of a career over the years.
Well, you've talked about your career. I'm wondering if you could show everyone the images of some of the works that you've done over the years, because when you were showing me the PowerPoint earlier, I noticed in kind of a loose way a progression of where you've gone, of looking over the illustration of your career, let's say.
So in school, I learned to paint for the first time, and this is one of the first paintings I did that actually sort of turned out the way I imagined in my head. It took me at least a year of like painting with oils and all that to kind of get a handle on the medium. And this was one of the first things. And we did a lot of self-portraits because we couldn't afford to hire models, so it was just yourself. And we learned to take reference photos to turn into paintings, which was a big thing because I always wondered how do people paint figures and everything. And so learning to kind of the process, that technique was really important and interesting. My friend Matt became the alien at the bottom. So at a point in time, I was really interested in sort of manga, anime, sci-fi. So I would play with the tropes a lot, like aliens, robots, and all the giant robots for some reason.
Was this inspired by Astro Boy?
That's right. Yeah. But I guess imagine if he was sort of semi-human, and that the radioactive power that gave him energy also made him sort of sickly at the same time. That's the idea. I was really obsessed with Sanrio for a while, Hello Kitty and all those characters. I think it was strange to me that people were so engaged with these characters who really had no real personality or story, but somehow they became iconic figures that people really found, I don't know, like they really engaged with at some level. And this is one of the, I would say, I took a class at RISD to do comics, and this is one of the, this is the final project I did for class, and sort of became something that I worked on for quite a while after that. I think Derek has seen some of this work.
Well, talk a bit about, let's pause here for a moment and talk about Malinky Robot, because I know that, I think this was the very first thing I ever saw of yours.
Okay.
Especially in terms of a complete story. And, I mean, do you feel that this was in some ways a breakout project for you?
Well, like I say, it's not a breakout, but sort of one small step. So I think this, I sent it into a grant at the time called the Zarek Grant, which was the grant that the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had set up, because TMNT, when it first began, was also a black and white indie comic that became this huge sort of franchise. So the creators, for at least I think 10 years, they wanted to put money back into the industry. So they had this grant called the Zarek Grant that a lot of indie creators would apply for. So I got a grant and I self-published this book, and I think that's where Kazuki Bishi, you guys might know, he does Amulet for Scholastics, and also an anthology called Flight. So I think that's where he saw that story and asked me to do stories for Flight, and that's what I kind of mean by getting your work out there, even if it's just self-published stuff. If you might get seen by the right person at the right time, you get new sort of opportunities to do stories for people that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
And then this caught some people's attention?
It was published by SLG, Slate Lithographics back then, I think. Well, this is a whole different story. I was went to Comic-Con to kind of show my work. And I had my first Marvel sort of one-page thing for Iron Man through meeting Chris Claremont, actually, at the Comic-Con. And let me see. Okay. So this is going backwards a bit. So I sent my portfolio to DC Vertigo, and they sent me a sort of a new comic they were doing at the time. It was called Fables, which some of you might have read. And at the point I was ready to kind of draw comics, but I wasn't quite ready yet. So I didn't do too well on this pencil test, so I didn't get a job. And of course, Fables went on to become this huge success for Vertigo. And what I did end up doing instead was join a computer game company in Boston, where for about a year I did concept art for a MMORPG called, I think, Ashran's Call or something like that. It wasn't really a big game, but it was one of the earlier role-playing games at that time. And what I ended up doing was, because Vertigo didn't think I was ready for a long series, but they willing to take a risk on me for a mini-series of just 4 issues. So this is my first sort of major gig with DC.
And then you did this with Mike Carey,
Mike
who,
Carey, yeah.
you know, it's quite a big name. And at this point, I mean, he's still working on the Lucifer series, wasn't he? Or he had just wrapped it up? Was it around that time?
I think it was maybe around the same time, because this is more comedic, so he kind of, it was a chance for him to sort of stretch his comedic legs, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the inks were by, you know, Mark Hamill, who also he did this Sandman pages back then.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's another case of me not quite being ready yet to do comics, because I was supposed to be doing the pencils and inks for this story, but when I turned in my first issue, Shelley Bond kind of wrote me an email saying that they're all right, but not quite polished enough, so they got Hamill to ink over my pencils eventually.
I mean, is that an experience that, you know, you learn from, you know, someone in the industry, you know, Shelley Bond, who is now the editor of, the executive editor of Vertigo, telling you something that you may not have wanted to hear, but she was telling it like it is.
I was very aware of it. When I saw the pages myself, when I inked it, I kind of could see that it wasn't as polished as it should have been. And it was partly because I was could have been a time factor, because I was still working at Turbine at the time, 9 to 5, and coming home to do the comics. And I had at some level thought I could juggle sort of a full-time job and drawing comics on the side, but as it turns out, a comic book is a full-time job. So that's one reason why I left the US, because after RISD, they gave me a 1-year visa to look for a job, and after that you had to kind of find a full-time job to stay in the US. And so I sort of had a choice between staying in the games industry and getting a work visa here, or going back home to Singapore to draw comics. And you know, since I always wanted to draw comics, I thought, you know, I would just go back and draw those comics. And so my early stuff that I did on my own has this pencil quality to it, the pencil line, and that's also partly a result of not being really good at inking at that point in time. So this is kind of the way I could find a way to kind of make the pencils look sort of polished by adding color to it and adjusting the sort of contrast and all that stuff. But I like this look though. I still use it once in a while for my work nowadays. If I want a sort of softer approach or sort of a more gentle feel to the artwork, I still like to draw pencils with colors. So a lot of robots still.
And these are all images that you're showing us now from Malinky Robot.
Yeah, Malinky Robot, that's right. And I think I mentioned this before. This is one of the... if you guys read Charlie Chan Hock Chye, which is my latest book, it's what's maybe sort of different about it is that it tries to tell a story through different styles and genres put together. So, and this is kind of the beginning of sort of that kind of approach to comics that I've tried. So in this scene, we see the 3 kids sitting in a McDonald's talking about a friend of theirs that they all kind of know, and they're all telling stories about him. But what happens is that every story that's told is told in a different comic style. So the first kid tells the style in sort of an indie black and white comic, I would say close to, let's say, someone like Max Anderson's Pixie. Mm-hmm. And then another kid tells the story in terms of Sunday Pages, comic strips. And then the third kid tells the story in a sort of adventure style comic. And how it's supposed to work is that the individual strips and comics are sort of self-contained. They kind of tell their own story, but when you put them together side by side, they have a narrative that also, that kind of overlays it as well. And I found it really interesting because it's a way of, in a way, letting the reader do a bit more work when they're reading it, like trying to figure out how things are kind of put together. And it's just fun for me to try different styles. You know, I like comics, and I like sort of the whole range of what's possible in comics. And this is one way of kind of being able to do everything at once, in a way.
Now, you mentioned your brand new book, Charlie Chan, and I'm wondering does the genesis of the new book have its roots? I mean, does it go back to Malinky Robot, where you're playing around with these different styles as they apply to storytelling?
I think so. Yeah, for sure. When I look back at it, I didn't think about it at the time, but putting these slides together, I sort of saw the sort of genesis or lineage from it.
Okay. Well, for those who aren't familiar with the new book, could you establish a premise and introduce us to?
Well, go all the way to. Can I just click all the way to the end?
Oh, sure.
Okay, let's go very quickly. Okay. So the sort of background thing to this is sort of Singapore's history and politics. And I think what's unusual about Singapore is that we've had one party in charge for the last 50 years. I mean, basically since our independence from the British Empire, Singapore has had one party in charge. And what makes it even more different than a lot of other countries who had a sort of a long-term one government thing is that they are in fact fairly elected in democratic elections. You know, I mean, obviously there's some gerrymandering involved and all that, but essentially they're a fairly elected government for the past 50 years. And that's mainly based on their sort of achievements in developing the country, in stability and all that. But what this control over 50 years has allowed them to do is to essentially tell their version of history. As I think with any party who's been charged for that long, they're able to control the media to some extent. They kind of control the narrative. But at the same time, I think most of us living in Singapore are aware that there is sort of a I wouldn't say revisionist, but a more inclusive history that's out there of what's happened in our past. And so Charlie Chan, Hock Chye is in part a look at that history, sort of what has been left out of the mainstream official narrative, through the eyes of a fictional comic artist, right, called Charlie Chan, Hock Chye, and sort of his comic. So we see him sort of I'm drawing him at some point, sort of like an interview sort of thing, and then at other points we see his comics. And again, it's sort of like the Malinky Robot stuff where they are kind of self-contained, but when you put them together, they tell a wider story.
So you're creating a fictional character in Charlie Chan Hock Chye, and at the same time, you're trying to recreate his art as distinctive from your own.
That's right. Yeah.
How much of a challenge was that?
It's scary. I mean, there were many different parts to it. Like the early stuff was sort of Tezuka influence, like Japanese manga influence, and then later on you will see oil paintings and even stuff that's inspired by Harvey Kurtzman and sort of the war comics he did. So every time I finished a section and had to move on to the next one, I would have no idea if I could pull it off, right? Until I did at least maybe 2 or 3 pages, and I would kind of start to feel like I was getting that it looked possibly like the thing that I wanted it to look like. So yeah, every time I got to a new section, I would be sweating until I actually done it.
Well, much of the book has comics like, what is the title of the one here on our right as we look at
Bukit Japalang, call it, which is a Malay name for like a village of many things, something like that. Yeah.
And I mean, it obviously has a Walt Kelly pogo feel to it, and again, it took up quite a bit of the story, and I'm wondering if Walt Kelly is just as Kurtzman in the story Trust. If you chose the styles of those creators who influenced you,
partly. I mean, I think the main challenge really was to find the right fit between the comic that I wanted to use and sort of the narrative that was going on underneath. I was recently listening to a interview with Kazuo Ishiguro, his new book called The Buried Giant, where he talked about how he struggled for like 10 years to find the right sort of vehicle to tell a story, right? And I think this is a sort of similar thing where I'm trying to find the right comic to fit the narrative. And in this case, when I was reading about, so this part of the comic deals mainly with Singapore's merger and subsequent separation from Malaysia after we kind of left the British Empire. And to me, when I read it, the politicking involved, sort of all the fights between the various parties, it felt a little bit childish to me, like a little silly at times, even though they were dealing with really serious issues. And so the two comics that I came down to choose between was actually Peanuts and Pogo, right? And in the end, I chose Pogo because I thought being able to use animals who were also kind of species you found in Southeast Asia gave it the right flavor, I think. So yeah, it was a lot of people just trying to find the right fit between things. And also, obviously, if I liked the creators themselves, it helped that I could sort of pay homage to them when I was reading the comic. So some Mad Magazine stuff and some... This actually was my attempt to merge, I guess, Kirby, Kurtzman, and... What's the Japanese guy? Tatsumi. So try to mix the different styles together. And some... Have you guys seen Dark Knight Returns? Frank Miller? So there's one section where I kind of use the Frank Miller structure to tell the story.
Yeah, it has that Dark Knight Returns feel to it. Yeah.
And part of the story is that the publisher in Singapore had applied for a grant to do the book, and when the book came out, the National Art Council actually withdrew the grant because they felt that the story which challenged their narrative was too subversive, so they withdrew the grant. Which was, for a while we were a bit worried because, comics don't make much money just in general, so we were worried about our margins. But as it turned out, once the grant was withdrawn and it came out in social media, we got a lot of support from readers, and the book sold like hotcakes for quite a while.
In Singapore?
In Singapore, yeah.
Okay, because I was going to ask about the success of the book.
This is the turnout
in Singapore.
Kinokuniya. We sold like 400 books of that one day, which is crazy. Yeah.
And I know the book has only been out a little more than a month here in the United States. What kind of reaction that you know of has there been to the new book?
I think the main good thing that happened was that we had a very good review on NPR Fresh Air. So that got us a lot of attention, and I think I was tracking sort of the Amazon numbers, right? And it was we were in like 10,000 when it first came out, and then right after the NPR thing, we shot up to maybe as high as like 200 or 300. We were like the number one ranked seller for a few days on Amazon.
Wow!
So it's been So we were still hoping that New York Times will cover it, but. As I've learned from even Chip Kidd, Chip Kidd, the famous designer, he says he has no idea how it's get reviewed or not get reviewed in New York Times. So, we'll see. Yeah.
Well, I know one of the things that I'm sure that many of our audience would appreciate is your insights in connections between what you do in terms of comics and illustration and gaming, because you mentioned that earlier in your career you did work in the gaming industry. So I'd like to ask you to talk about what you see as that link, but I also would like, and I'm sure you would as well, to encourage the audience to chime in and ask questions that they may have on this very topic.
Okay. Any questions on there? Okay.
It's actually a slightly different topic. Now that you've worked for the comic books that you wanted to work for growing up as a kid or whatever, where do you want to go from here? So, like, your new book is another stepping stone, like your previous books. Where do you want to go?
Ideally, I would like to work on more books like this one. If I could have a chance to. I think that you're never going to get as much money doing this as you would for working for Marvel and DC, because the sort of the page rates that they pay you are significantly higher than any sort of even a mainstream publisher of books will not give you an advance as high as what you get working on Dr. Fate or any Marvel or DC property. So there's still a balance to be struck. I still feel like I have to do balance sort of doing Dr. Fate for a couple of months and then saving some money before doing my next more personal book. But the success that this book has had, I think, will give me sort of more opportunities to do that, just because the publishers will pay you a higher advance based on your past track success. Like, when I, like 5 years ago, when I approached publishers, like to do any book that I wanted to do, they would ask me like, what did your last book sell? You know, and that was the main thing that they will look at, because it's about, they have to make money as well to pay their bills. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Since you graduated from Rhode Island, have you been able to entirely support yourself off of your art, whether it is like concept for games or comics or anything like that, or have you had to take like other odd jobs, freelance?
Yeah, I mean, once in a while I'll do like an advertising thing where, you know, they pay, even in Singapore, it pays a lot, advertising pays money. The thing about Singapore is that advertising is probably the only, advertising and government work is probably the only things that pays illustration well. Magazine work is pretty poor because we have a sort of a small population, and therefore that means small circulation, small advertising, blah, 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 and it kind of, so you can't survive doing magazine work in Singapore, but you can sort of do advertising stuff. But less of it the last few years, I think, especially with the DC stuff, I can, you know, sort of make a reasonable living doing that.
Well, you mentioned the DC stuff. How much of a difference did working on Dr. Fate mean? And I know it's only been, not even 2 years since you...
Well, a year actually, 12 issues.
Wow, only 12 issues. Wow, time just flying. But how much difference has that made in terms of the kind of attention you get?
I'm not sure exactly, because Dr. Fate is not the bestseller for DC, obviously. I think we are ranked like 43 out of 52 books. And my art style is not mainstream, so people who like Dr. Fate would tend to also, I guess, really be interested in sort of more independent alternative comics. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how much breakthrough I've made into sort of the mainstream readership.
Okay.
Yeah, but I don't. Okay.
How long did you create your recent book?
I'm going to guesstimate about 2.5 years. Although the first year I was still working on the Shadow Hero at the same time, so I was doing research and doing that comic at the same time. So that year was, you know, very. It wasn't just doing that one book, but having finished the research and done the thumbnails, I think I spent a 1.5 years doing the actual artwork itself.
I was wondering, is there a difference between the art scene in Singapore and the art scene in America, or are they very similar?
Art scene, I don't know about. The comic scene is very different. We don't really have an industry in Singapore. Like, there is no dedicated comics publisher, whereas in the US you have like so many of publishers, mainstream, indie, you know. In Singapore we have publishers who do comics, but it's usually something to do on the side rather than something that they focus on. And even the ones that do comics tend to publish stuff from overseas. Like, there's a company called Chye who mainly do translations or sort of versions from Taiwan or Hong Kong. So the local industry is really quite small. I think there are maybe 2 or 3 of us who do it full time in Singapore. You know, so it's tiny.
Well, there's that part in your new book where Chye and a friend approach. It's what, the friend's uncle?
His uncle.
His uncle, who is a printer and publisher, about the idea of publishing a comic book, and it's almost as if they have to cobble things on their own together in order to get some kind of recognition. So, I mean, right there's just not that kind of industry there in Singapore to support that.
Which is true, because I think anyone doing comics in Singapore now, we kind of say they have to kind of relearn to make the wheel every time. Whether you're self-publishing or looking for a publisher, you have to kind of push really hard. You know, that there isn't sort of established institutions you can go to learn from. Like, let's say in Japan with manga, you can sort of be apprenticed to a established artist and learn the craft. In Singapore, you're sort of pulling yourselves up by the bootstraps still. I'm guessing you improve, you know, over the next few years, but at present it's still that's kind of the situation now.
So, did you write the book as well as illustrate it?
For Charlie Chan, I'll try, yes, and also Monkey Robot. The ones in between, like the DC stuff, I work with writers, but yeah.
How much more difficult is it to get on as a writer for a comic industry than it is to get on as an artist?
No, I don't think that there's. If you're talking about like Marvel, DC, or just doing your own
Just
work.
in general.
I suppose there isn't really much difference. It's still about getting your work seen and heard by the right people. I know a lot of writers who broke into the industry by doing their own zines first, or doing self-publishing, or sort of working with smaller publishers first before getting their work to the DC or Marvel. So it's the same case with artists. I think I don't see. I'm going to guess that it's easier in a sense to be an artist because you can just show your work visually. People can see what's going on. Whereas a writer, it takes a little more time to read through a script. But I haven't tried that route, so I can't quite sure what the difference is.
After entering the industry, what's the next most difficult obstacles you faced?
I suppose as a freelancer, you worry about long-term career prospects a lot. Most jobs, I guess you get health insurance, you get even a pension if you're lucky at some point. But as a freelancer, everything is you kind of make everything on your own. So, I think that's one thing I'm trying in Singapore to get other freelancers to recognize is that the need for financial planning is important. Your first 10 years, maybe when you're really young, you can sort of take risks, but at some point in your career, you have to start worrying about longer term things, which I think it's true of the first generation people like Jack Kirby or even Wally Wood, right? A lot of them who were really successful in their early career ended up not so well off in their late careers because they had poor financial planning or poor contracts in the beginning. So I think it's that part of it is something that most of us artists don't really look at, just because we were focused on drawing and writing. So I think that's one thing which I'm slowly learning to get to grips with.
So that's a lesson for freelancers. Make sure that you pay more attention to your financial planning. You sound like a commercial for Merrill Lynch.
I'm trying to get call a talk in Singapore with financial people to give to freelancers, but still in the works. I think I need to learn it as well myself.
I really appreciated in Charlie Chan the pastiche of all those different styles of comics, from the very indie underground styles to these more mainstream things. I know you mentioned artists like Daniel Klaus, Chris Ware in terms of the more personal work. Are there any other artists you would say had influence in terms of like artists who make more personal, somewhat confessional sort of work?
Chester Brown is one of them. I really like his stuff. Seth is interesting. Seth, to me, it's interesting. Like he's not as confessional as the rest, but he does interesting things with sort of the format of things. I think Wimbledon Green was interesting to me, as was what's the other one? The Eskimos.
You talking about from his notebook?
No.
Series?
This big book featuring a guy who went to the North Pole or something.
Oh, you're talking George Sprott.
George Sprott. Who else do I like? This guy, Japanese manga creator called Jiro Taniguchi, I find really interesting. But I think many of those three, Chester Brown, Daniel Clovis, Chris Ware, those are my kind of people that I really like looking at. Actually, a lot of others, but people I like, but I don't think I'm so influenced by. People like Mark Bayer, Cats, who just released a big underworld.
Oh, the Underworld
collection.
anthology.
So I like a lot of artists, but I think only a small group I find have maybe influenced me more than others.
Or Art Spiegelman's work?
Oh yeah. Well, in this book, the animals thing was kind of from Spiegelman, but I don't think, because Spiegelman's Mouse, obviously everyone has read that, but his other works are, I think, even more experimental, and I haven't read a lot of those, I must say.
And now this question was about the kind of influences and the people that you tend to gravitate toward and aspire to. What about titles that you read on a regular basis? What are you reading now? What have you read over the past several months? In other words, when Sonny Liew picks up a comic, what is that comic?
So I'll preface by saying that one problem with working like a full-time mainstream comics is that you don't have a lot of time. So I haven't read a lot of comics regularly over the last few years, and also I think the other thing is it's sort of a occupational hazard where when you're making comics and you're reading other comics, you maybe a bit more critical. You know, I don't enjoy comics the same way I did before I started making comics. You know, I think it's the same thing as a filmmaker, right? When you do making films, you sort of look at movies a different way, you know, and you're comparing yourself to them as well. So it becomes a little more tricky. Having said that, the one comic I read recently that I really enjoyed was Good Night Pun Pun by, I want to say
Inio Asano.
Inio Asano, yes. Really interesting manga. I hadn't seen anything like that for quite a while. He draws sort of realistic backgrounds and mostly realistic characters, but the main character is sort of a very roughly sketched bird. You know, it's really interesting. I found it fascinating.
Yeah, I read that recently and discussed it on the podcast, and it's wild. It's I think applying the word psychedelic at times to that story is not inappropriate. And I have to say, Goodnight Pun Pun, that first volume that just recently came out, it has to be one of my favorite reads over the past 6 months, hands down.
But I hear it gets really, really dark in the next volumes. Like this is really quite dark now, but I hear it gets much darker in the next few books. So I'm not sure what to expect from it, really.
In order to get to your most recent book slides, you had to skip past a lot of your previous.
I can go back. I kick myself. Okay, so this was one of the things that I turned down from Top Shelf. They offered me this gig to do a book called The Surrogates, which I turned down because I thought the script wasn't that strong, and I call it a disaster because a few years later it became a movie starring Bruce Willis, and you know, we would have made some money off that. And what I did instead of that was a book called Wonderland for Disney Press and SLG, which is a sort of a sequel to the Disney version of Wonderland, you know. And the girl you see here actually isn't Alice; it's the White Rabbit's maid, Mary Ann. And the writer Tommy Kovac wanted to explore her story within sort of the Wonderland setting. Regiftus was a DC Minx book. DC Minx doesn't exist anymore. It was Shelley Bond's sort of passion project for a while. She wanted to essentially break into the manga market because at the time, especially the female reading manga audience was growing a lot. So DC wanted to kind of, I wouldn't say exploit, but to kind of get into that market. So they did a bunch of books that were manga size, black and white, supposedly female friendly. They got a lot of flack for it for having mainly male creators do this series. So yeah.
In fact, I was really fascinated by that series as a phenomenon, if nothing else, because here you have a major publisher, DC, getting into, quote unquote, the manga-like industry, and you know the audience for these books. I mean, I remember at the time when they came out, it just seemed younger, more female, although not necessarily so, because I read a good number of I thought they were really good, both in terms of the story, the art, but also the packaging, right? The fact that they are about the size of what you would consider typical or the usual manga made it attractive in its own right, but it didn't last.
Well, when I talk to people like Paul Levitt, who was, I think, at the time the president of DC, his take on it is that the book got lost just in terms of placement in bookstores because bookstores didn't know whether to put it in manga, put it in YA, put it in comics, and it kind of got lost in sort of in the mix because of that. My own take is that it was manga-like, but not quite manga enough, you know, and that's why it got lost because part of the appeal of manga is that you do get like 3, 4, 20 volumes of it. So once you start reading a manga, you can kind of read the whole series, and it kind of draws you in. Whereas the DC Minx book was just mostly single story, self-contained. So it never quite had that.
There was only one title that had a continuation. I think
like 2 books,
the Plain
right?
Janes.
Yeah. So it wasn't really a manga book in that sense. So I thought, aside from the bookstore problems, just the whole structure of those books, would never quite have been. Maybe wrong timing. Like now, people like Reina Telemiger,
Telemiger,
right? So someone like that. I think that the industry has matured a lot more in the last 5-10 years. So a book like this might have done better now than it did back then.
Well, to continue going through some of your earlier work.
Because I still like paintings once in a while. It's something that I wish I had more time for, but when I get a chance to, I do paintings. This one is quite political. One of the it's hard to explain, but anyway. So I also did some covers for Marvel's Jane Austen adaptations. They wanted to make it look like a magazine, so. And then I did the sort of the cover and yeah.
So when you paint, do you work primarily with oils then, or do you work with any other mediums?
No, these are actually all done in Photoshop. But I think it's possible because I used to work in oils, or I still work in oils, so I can sort of apply the same techniques or approach to these paintings that I do with my oil paintings and make it look as if it's non-digital at some level. Yeah. So these are the interiors for the book.
Sense and Sensibility.
Sensibility. Yeah. Which I thought was too wordy, too many words. Because it's Jane Austen, you have to adapt the words, and then in the comic form, it's kind of tricky. But this was with Roger Langridge, a Spider-Man story. And I think you also see sort of aside from the storytelling stuff that I do, I also like playing with textures and making things look old. So in Charlie Chan Chye, one of the things I do is to make fake old comics. And this is kind of part of that development as well. Like this is like a fake original art piece. In fact, it's actually just a brand new drawing, but you overlay it with textures, with fake Scotch tape and everything to make it look as if it's old.
Mm-hmm.
And Shadow Hero, have you read this? Maybe. Okay. This is Eugene Yang, who's comic artist right now doing Superman for DC. Very engaged with sort of Asian American issues in his comics, and this is essentially the story about the first Asian American superhero was created in the 1950s.
The Green Turtle.
The Green Turtle.
Yeah.
And sort of how he became, because in the original stories, I think it lasted 4 or 5 issues at best. And there'll always be a scene where he would start to tell his story of how he became the Green Turtle. And every time he started, began to tell a story, there'd be an emergency somewhere else, and he'd run off, and he never would tell his origin story. And Gene thought we could do sort of his version of it, of what happened.
And his face was hidden in the original comic. So there was a question as to the ethnicity or the roots or the nationality of the hero and his family.
That's right, because creator Chu Hing was Asian, and he wanted to create an Asian hero, but the publisher didn't want that because they thought, we need white Caucasian superheroes just like we do in movies today. So in order to sort of get around that, he just didn't want to. Wouldn't draw the hero from the front, right? So you couldn't tell what he looked like. So in one chapter of this book, we kind of paid homage to that by having the Green Turtle only appear from the back. And the other thing that was interesting was that if you look at the coloring of the original comics, all the agents are like really yellow color, and all the Caucasians are pink, and the Green Turtle was also pink in color to be Caucasian. So we also find a way to explain why he would turn pink when it would rain or it got wet in the story. That's Dr. Fate. I've been fun to do. The covers have been really fun. They give me a lot of leeway to try different styles and approaches in the covers.
These are some of the interiors from Dr. Fate.
This is why cars cost so much in Singapore. In order to own a car, you have to buy a license to have the right to own a car, and that license you have to bid for it with other people, or actually no, the car dealers will bid for it, and it costs maybe anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000 to get that certificate, and it's only valid for 10 years. So every 10 years you have to buy a new car. So it's very expensive in Singapore to own a car, and their rationale is that it prevents traffic jams because less cars means less traffic. So that's how they. And I guess the relevance to what Singapore is today is just that I can't think of many governments who've been able to do that, like to introduce a law that will make cars so expensive. But because they have done, yeah.
So does Singapore have a pretty good public transportation system? You said bikes a lot there?
Not so much bikes, more like the trains and buses are pretty good. Yeah. Although I think we are a little bit spoiled and pampered, so whenever there's a breakdown, we get very angry at the government. So if you're going to make cars so expensive, you better make sure your train runs all the time. So, yeah.
Since the transportation system is so important in Singapore, or whatever, like if the trains break down, does your office like give you extra time for things? Or do they care? Do they? Like,
I'm sure they do. Yeah, they understand that, because it's so small that anything that happens, everyone knows about it. So your company will know that there is a breakdown if it happens. And that's Lee Kuan Yew, who was our prime minister for how long was it? 31 years, and he just passed away last year, which was interesting for the book because while I was making the book, he was still alive. So and he was very ill, and I kept wondering whether the book would come out before or after he had passed away, because it would kind of change the angle a little bit, because he was one of the major people featured in the book. So his sort of status as alive or dead would affect sort of how the story was told to some degree. As it turned out, he passed away, I think, a few months before the book came out, so we could do the adjustments within it.
From what you could gather, do you think his passing had anything to do with the response to the book in Singapore?
No. I mean, it came out after he passed.
Right. But do you think that had he still been alive when the book initially came out, there'd be less interest? Or, I mean, there's no way of knowing, obviously, but...
No, I think sort of the debate in Singapore about our history has been ongoing for a few years, so that part of it I don't think would have been affected. What would have been interesting for me really was that if he had read the book, I would have been really interested in his response to it. Actually, what's interesting is that the book features him and another politician called Lim Chin Siong, who is not featured here, but he was kind of the major opposition figure in the early 50s and 60s. And he was the one who has been essentially, well, not completely, but mostly whitewashed from our history. But in my book, he's kind of the main figure in story. And last month we had an exhibition of artwork from the book, and his son actually sort of called me up and said he wanted to kind of meet me and talk about his father, which is really interesting. I haven't met him yet, but I will when I go back to Singapore.
Oh.
Yeah.
How often are elections held in Singapore?
Every 4 years, just like here, yeah. And it's to get a sense of how dominant they are. They have had a majority in the parliament of at least 90% every election for the last 50 years. So you can imagine if the Senate and Congress were all like Democrats or all Republicans, that's how much control they have. And for them, it allows them to kind of carry out long-term policies. And they would argue that sort of Western democracy, one of the flaws is that you're only thinking every 4 years, right? So every 4 years you have a cycle, and the party can vote it out, and then you switch sort of policy. So there's less chance for long-term planning in Western democracies. That's at least the PAP's argument for it.
Well, you're talking about Singapore and then Singapore's history, and I'm wondering, given the links to British rule, when it comes to comics, illustration, has historically there been more of an influence of British art and creators than, let's say, other Western creators, let's say U.S. comics creators, or even Japanese manga for that matter?
No, my sense is that everything has come to Singapore. Like, I think we had a sort of a boom time in the 80s where a lot of people got interested in comics, and by that stage, you're getting a lot of American comics. So no, it was. I think probably more American than anything else. And then later on, now it's kind of manga. The British stuff is probably actually in a minority now.
Okay, so not as much Beano or 2000 AD or.
No, definitely not. I read it once growing up, but it wasn't. Most of my friends didn't read those things.
Okay. Does anybody have any other questions for Sonny about his work or his experiences, or even suggestions he may have when it comes to the industries?
Growing up, was your family pretty supportive of you wanting to be a comics artist, or were they a little skeptical?
A bit of both. Like I think what helped was that my first comic was for a local newspaper, and I got paid a bit of money for it. So I think they saw that I could get paid some money to do comics. At the same time, they made sure I finished my first college degree in philosophy, which is a lot of money in the racket. But they thought I had a fallback sort of degree to go back to if this didn't pan out. So.
I think that's the first time in life that someone has said that a degree in philosophy is a fallback plan.
That's how impractical I am. So they've been supportive. I mean, they've always worried about sort of money. Every other month they'll ask me, "What's your next project? What are you going to do next? Do you have enough money to last a career at that?" But I think the last couple of years have been good enough that they sort of see the light.
Well, and did some of your experiences growing up with your parents and their reaction to your interest in art play itself out to some degree in the new book, where we see Hock Chye's parents concerned about his future?
For sure, but I think it's a pretty universal experience for any artist. So to me, my own experience is just one of many, right? So people like Jack Kirby, Wally Wood, Tezuka, anyone out there, as an artist would have parents who are concerned about what they're doing. If a painter, animator, and any of those things, I think that's, your parents are going to worry about you if you're doing any of that.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys can all empathize with that.
Yeah. How many of you here want to do comics as opposed to? Oh, cool.
About 5 or 6.
So, as far as like publishing, any tips on who to talk to or how to talk to certain people and getting your comic?
I suppose the who part, probably the easiest way is to find a publisher who does work that is similar to what you want to do. Like, so if you're doing like Vertigo style stuff, you go to Vertigo. If you're doing superheroes, you go to Marvel or DC, right? So just take a look at what books they produce, and find the right fit, and those will be the people you can best approach in terms of who, in terms of how. I guess be professional. Although there are kind of so many kinds of people who do comics. Some people are probably not that professional, but if the work is really good, people still hire you to do stuff. But yeah, I mean, especially early on, if you keep the deadlines, if you can be professional in replying to emails regularly, I think that's not a bad thing.
If you have the chance to work on any sort of project or any kind of dream book or something,
Okay.
without worrying about any financial situations and stuff, what would you want to do?
Well, 2 years ago, I would have said Charlie Chan Hock Chye, which is sort of when I did it. I had no idea what the reception would be, and the publisher in Singapore actually only paid me, I think, $8,000 for the whole project. So the advance was 8,000 Sing dollars, which is about 7,000 USD, and I had to live off that for essentially 2.5 years, or at least 2 years. So every month I was draining my savings, paying rental, paying Wi-Fi costs, everything else. So for those 1.5 years, I was very conscious that I was not making any money. I was actually losing money, but at the same time, for some reason, the first 40 pages I was doing, it felt as if just felt right. Like I knew it was going somewhere. Like I felt like this is a book that I had to finish, whatever happened. And now I would say do another big book like this. I have something in mind right now that I want to work on. As soon as I finish Dr. Fate, I will be trying to work on a new 300-page graphic novel. Yeah.
So how's the process for that usually go? Do you make a pitch and then they accept it, they give you the advance and like a deadline or like stuff like that, and then you work on it until it's done?
Yeah. Most of the time you send a pitch in. So the pitch will consist of sort of the rough outline together with 6 to 12 pages of finished art. And those that I've seen, like my agent used to send me sort of pitches that other people put together to show me how to do it, and that's the package that I seen was a synopsis, maybe some character designs, and then some finished artwork. I suppose as you get more experience and you get more books published, you can take a shorter cut. You can just propose an idea, and if you're lucky, they will pick it up.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming to listen to Sonny, and I especially want to thank Sonny for taking the time to talk with us. He will be signing copies of, I think we have both the new book and also Malinky Robot that is out there. So, feel free to come by and talk with Sonny one-on-one. So thank you, Sonny.
All right. Thank you.